So when the Adeptus Astartes inevitably get another huge release wave in Warhammer 40k, exactly what are they most likely to get? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines once more, and in this video I thought we could talk a little bit about the possibilities for future release waves for the faction. Much to the eye rolls of the Warhammer 40k factions that haven't had anything major for them for quite some time, about the one thing that seems the most certain in Warhammer 40k is new big releases for the Space Marines each and every edition. They're the biggest and most well-known army in the setting, with a bigger player base than any other army. And that means that for Games Workshop, basically every Space Marine release does a bit better than your standard one for any other faction they might come out with, prompting Games Workshop to release more things for Space Marines than any other faction out there, developing big sub-ranges for them as they've done with some of the notable Divergent chapters, which in turn inevitably leads to even more Space Marine players due to a constant parade of new shiny things coming out for them. In this one I thought we could talk about when the Astartes are next most likely to get another release and what might come when they do. Since the dawn of 8th edition and the Primaris, Games Workshop changed what they did for Warhammer releases in quite a big way. It didn't used to be that every single army would get a new codex and a new miniature each edition, but perhaps a slightly less obvious trend has been exactly what they do with the Space Marine miniatures, which does seem to be at least kind of consistent throughout 8th and 9th, so at least has a good chance of predicting 10th. Over the last 3 launch boxes, Space Marines always get a big release wave at the very start of the edition, a big monopose box facing off against another faction, and then a whole bunch of multi-part plastic kits to follow up those releases, some stuff that's just the same as the box but with more options, and a few extra things besides. It also seems to be kind of consistent that they get another smaller release wave late in each edition as well. In 8th edition we had Shadow Spear with the Phobos Marines and the Invictus Tactical Warsuit, and in 9th edition we had Strike Force Agastus, perhaps not quite as widely popular a one, with the Brutalis Dreadnought, Desolation Squad, and the multi-part Lieutenant. Another thing that seems to be a hint are some focus on the Codex chapters late in the edition, which we've had both in 8th and 9th. We had their own supplement codexes and a unique character miniature late in 8th edition. And then in 9th edition it looked like they might have been gearing up to do the same, but instead they just came out with Battle Force box sets, one for each chapter. And there was a bit of speculation as to whether or not Games Workshop was planning to do some sort of supplement codex system for the last days of the edition, and maybe change course a little bit later in the day than they sometimes do. Plus beyond that, for the special Snowflake chapters, the more divergent ones like Blood Angels, Space Wolves and Dark Angels and the like, they also have the potential for their own releases with their own codexes, and there can also be some scattered releases beyond this, potentially things for Kill Team these days, or maybe as part of an end of edition campaign as we got several special characters alongside Arcs of Omen last year. I guess given all that, the next most likely times to get Space Marine releases are probably going to be in some sort of later edition box set, similar to Strike Force Agastus or Shadow Spear perhaps, and maybe some goodies for the Space Wolves and Black Templars along with their codexes, before no doubt even more stuff coming in 11th. Looking through the Space Marine range, there's definitely some things that seem near enough certain that they'll redo, and then a whole bunch of things that have big question marks, and might or might not reinterpret in a Primaris sort of format. Maybe one of the most obvious ones that'll get an update are the Terminator Assault Squad. I think people are generally kind of surprised they didn't drop these at the same sort of time as the regular Terminators. It's kind of obvious that they'll do these at some stage. They weren't removed from the codex, and they feel like really quite an easy release given that they've already got the base Terminator models. They just literally need to release the same kits but with some Lightning Claw and Thunderhammer and Storm Shield arms. I can't help but think this will be a good candidate for a late 10th edition release if they felt like it. That might seem like a sensible enough on-paper decision, have normal Terminators come out at the start of the edition, have the special Deathwing ones with the Dark Angels codex, and then finish up the edition with some Assault Terminators perhaps. Seems likely we get them at some point sooner or later though. Another one that I very strongly expect to get a Primaris reimagining are the Vanguard Veterans. There just doesn't really seem any major reason why they wouldn't do the same as they did with Stern Guard Veterans for these guys. Basically the same sort of idea, but with the new style jump packs, Primaris armor, and maybe being a bit more flexible with different marks of armor plates as the Stern Guard Veterans got. And they do seem a lot more possible now they've got the base jump intercessors to build off. Again, these ones feel like a really easy one that they could slot into some big combo Battle Force box, either a late 10th edition one or an 11th edition launch box potentially. Maybe a little bit less clear is what happens with Tactical Marines and Devastators. Both of these have a Primaris sort of counts as in the range already, but they're not quite the same. Standard Tactical Squad Marines with Bolters essentially just have their update in Primaris Intercessors, but the actual setup of the squad is a bit different, packing special weapons and heavy weapons in the unit, And I feel like that does give people quite a different idea about them in their heads at least. I'm genuinely a bit unsure as to which way Games Workshop might go with them. They could just literally remove them and make Intercessors the core troops for Space Marines. It does seem that they're very much committed to the Intercessor name. Now we've got Assault ones, Heavy ones, and Jump ones as well. Though I guess it's not impossible that we could also get a Primaris Tactical Squad to go alongside them. Maybe in the same way that we've still got Terminators alongside Gravis Marines for two different flavours of Space Marine in chunky exo armour. Or they could even do something like put an upgrade sprue in the Intercessor box if they fancied it to expand their weapon options with some specials or heavies. I'd be interested to hear your guys' takes on them. Do you think they're just going to retire them? Or do you think we'll be able to field Tactical Marines in some sort of form when 11th edition rolls around and Games Workshop continue with their Primaris rollout? It's maybe a similar sort of question for the Devastators. It certainly feels like Games Workshop's attempt at making Primaris Devastators were the Desolation Squad, everyone's favourite missile launcher on a missile launcher Marines. Again, I feel like they have very different feel though, and they haven't really been helped out by having an indirect fire weapon, so Games Workshop's absolutely nerfed them into oblivion. Plus, it doesn't really help that the actual models themselves are kind of unpopular with their whole gun setup. There were just some pretty weird design choices going on with them. Again, I feel like people would be very happy to see a Primaris style Devastator squad with all the weapons that you'd expect them to have, but whether or not it happens or not is a bit more questionable. Games Workshop don't tend to do quite as many units that have like 5 different war gear options these days, preferring instead to stick with something like 1 or 2. Beyond just Firstborn resculpts, there's a couple of other Primaris squads that feel like they could do with revisiting at some point. Suppressors feel like they've caught the short end of the stick in terms of Primaris releases. Everything else that came out with the Shadow Spear box set that was then reinterpreted into the Combat Patrol and then Vanguard Task Force now. They all got individual releases with a multi-build style kit. Suppressors for some reason were forgotten about. I feel like they could very easily come out with a unit of 3 of them in the box and maybe have the option to field them either with autocannons or something else. I feel something like a Marine Portable Onslaught Gatling Cannon could be kind of fun as an alternative maybe. I think a few people wouldn't be too displeased to see Outriders get some sort of update as well. They just kept their pretty simplistic mono-build models from the Indomitors box set, reasonable enough for rank and file bikers with chainswords, though I feel like a lot of people might like to see them get some slightly more punchy weapon options. Even just something like a Power Fist on the Sergeant would be pretty handy. Without the ability to take down really big tough stuff, biker armies are really put on the back foot, and that used to be a build that was at least somewhat viable in the distant past. Talking characters, I feel like Games Workshop have more than enough to go at for really quite a long time for Primaris updates. They could just literally chip away at ones that either have current models but no Primaris era release yet, or revisit ones that have taken away in the past. I feel like some of the ones that really made themselves a bit more notable were the resin ones that they chose not to take away in the codex, despite some of them having models that are no longer on sale. We've got Pedro Cantor, Darnath Lysander, Vulcan Hestan, and Cato Sicarius. As they go, I feel like these guys are all really quite big characters in the lore, important enough to their respective chapters to absolutely warrant an update, or at least with an aim to not having them just dropped out of the codex. I'm not sure when Games Workshop might get around to doing these sort of things, if indeed they do. My suspicion with the first wave of Primaris style characters with like Corsaro Khan and Ajax Agatone and friends was that they wound up producing far more of those than they initially wound up selling, not having quite as big a broad appeal as they might have hoped for maybe. I guess for each one of their characters for a specific chapter, you're catering to a much smaller part of the 40k audience than anything that's applicable to generic Space Marines. Say a Salamander's unique character is primarily just going to be of interest to Salamander's players, and even for those players that are only going to pick up at max 1 copy, if they even decide to do that and don't prefer to kit bash their own characters or something. I feel like if they do what they did with Psychic Awakening and Arcs of Omen again, it could be a good target for character resculpts in an end of edition campaign. We had Dante, Azrael and Farsight redone last time. Perhaps if they decided to bring one of these to the fore, then potentially it could be a target for a new miniature. Cato Sicarius already seems to have had his Primaris form showcased in the lore really quite a long time ago as well at this point. I want to say his Primaris artwork came from some time early in 9th edition, and might be a bit more of a hint that he is indeed getting an update at some time down the line. I feel like it would be pretty cool if Games Workshop moved towards having a little bit more support for the major codex chapters that get a lot of focus in Heresy, but maybe not quite as much as you might expect in the contemporary 40k setting. Though admittedly, given they've all got at least one character, it might be nice for the Chaos Marines to get a bit of prioritization to their Traitor Legion characters first. It would be good to see a bit of representation for things like Iron Warriors, Word Bearers, and Alpha Legion in 40k modern times. Otherwise, for Space Marines, whenever they have a release, I'm sure we'll continue to see a fairly constant parade of generic characters coming out. It's perhaps been a little bit surprising just how many sculpts Games Workshop have decided to make of basically the same sort of model, perhaps with very slightly tweaked wargear options, things like the Captain and Lieutenant style sculpts that we had tons of in 8th edition and 9th edition. It is kind of funny that Games Workshop fully entered meme territory for the amount of Primaris Lieutenant models that they came out with, made occasional jokes about it themselves, but also just kept on going. Having said that though, I'm still kind of slightly surprised they didn't get round to doing a Gravis armoured lieutenant yet, given that we've had about a million Tacticus ones, a couple of Furboss ones, and Gravis was right there from the word go in 8th edition. And beyond that, there's just really quite a lot of kind of obvious gaps they could choose to fill in the whole character lineup if they eventually wanted to. Things maybe like a biker captain perhaps, Terminator agents or lieutenants at the new scaling. Maybe a generic chapter master kit could be kind of fun, given that we basically have captains, lieutenants, and things like that, but at the same time, chapter masters do tend to be kind of unique to their own chapter in quite a big way, so I'm not sure how you'd do a generic one for that. Gravis Armor could have character options expanded if they had a mind to, things like chaplains and librarians perhaps. You could do more characters in jump packs, maybe even do dreadnought characters of some sort. We've had chaplain dreadnoughts in the past, and the Blood Angels have had their librarian ones. I feel like they'd probably be kind of low down the priority list though versus the rest. To be honest, I'm not really sure exactly how high priority the majority of these are, though I'm sure we'll see Games Workshop continue to fill in at least a few gaps as they roll out new Marine release waves, and likely some other wargear options and different sculpts to go alongside squads that they release, as they've done at the moment. They did say the Blade Guard Captain and Lieutenant when they dropped in 9th edition. It is kind of crazy to think what they could do with some other factions' HQ sections though, if they decided to show some Space Marine levels of attention to one of those for a while. Getting on to vehicles and war machines, one thing that I suspect will probably happen in the future is further development of the Redemptor class of dreadnoughts. It seems that over the first 3 years they decided to roll out a standard balance pattern with fist and big gun, then a dedicated melee version in the Brutalis, and then a dedicated ranged version in the Ballistus. But given the dreadnoughts that got retired, there's a few obvious options they could move on to beyond that. I feel like one of the single most likely might be a siege pattern of the Redemptor similar to the Ironclad. That was quite a well enjoyed trope, basically a dreadnought with a great big hammer for knocking down some fortifications and things, and a bit of extra armour as well. I could easily see that being a different chassis version of a Redemptor. They could do a venerable version with a particularly ornate chassis like we had for the Firstborn Marines, maybe alternative loadouts for the Ballistas such as auto cannons, which they could add as an extra sprue into the box, or they could even expand the Redemptor Dreadnought itself as they did with, say, Questoris Imperial Knights. Maybe add a bunch more weapon options, a different melee weapon, and a couple of different guns into an upgrade sprue. Push it in the box and likely charge a bit more for it. If 40k keeps on going at the same sort of rate as it has been at the moment, I really wouldn't be too surprised to see more flavours of Redemptor springing up over the years. One of the biggest questions about the Space Marine range going forward is what happens to the Rhino chassis tanks. I think a fair few people are expecting them to have some kind of reckoning when 11th edition comes around. Given the scope of the Firstborn range and replacement in 10th edition, quite a few people are expecting pretty much a mass replacement of most of the rest when the next edition launches, likely within 2 years' time at this point. There at least seems to be a reasonable chance that it could also be the death knell for a bunch of tracked vehicles of the Space Marines, either getting hover-style replacements or just being sent to Legends without them. The Predator, for example, already certainly looks like it's got its direct replacement in the Gladiator tank series, somewhat similar stylings and class of battle tank, but the Gladiator with its hover plates and things, seems likely the Predator tank will be retired and the Gladiator will just be the battle tank for the Space Marines going forward, though it does beg the question what happens with the rest. What I'm maybe a little bit uncertain about is what happens with the standard Rhino chassis. It kind of feels like we've already got the standard Primaris transport vehicle in the Impulsor, though maybe in people's minds I feel like it occupies a bit more of a similar space to the Razorback tank rather than the Rhino. It's got a smaller transport capacity and an upgrade slot on top, either a big gun or a shield dome. I also feel like the Rhino is one of the vehicles that's just quite so obviously recognisable and kind of iconic to the 40k setting. They even have a big sculpted one outside of Warhammer World. Plus it's used by a whole ton of different factions. I must admit, I think it would feel weird if loads of factions from Inquisition to Sisters of Battle to Chaos Space Marines could all use the Rhino tank, but the standard Space Marines suddenly couldn't. I'm honestly not too optimistic that the Rhino will survive, and maybe it'll just be the Impulsor as the only option from here on out. Though I guess maybe it's possible they release a more dedicated transport type one that's got a 10 Space Marine capacity and isn't covered in guns like the Repulsor is. Though I'm sure lots of people would be pretty happy if they just did an updated Rhino sculpt and basically made it a bit bigger and fancier and put Primaris scale Marines crewing it. Though so far they haven't really given us any hints that there'll be any tracked vehicles at all for the Space Marine range going forward. Otherwise, for the Rhino chassis, we've also got the Whirlwind and the Vindicator. Unlike the Predator, these are two ones that they haven't released a hover tank equivalent of yet. It seems perfectly possible that at some stage we'll see a Gladiator chassis tank filling out the role of one or more of these. Though I must admit, I feel like a big siege tank and an artillery tank would look a lot weirder on a hover chassis, just due to the weight of guns they're likely going to be carrying. I guess maybe they could do something like a Vindicator Laser Destroyer one, maybe taking some notes from the Forge World one maybe, and then have that as a hover tank perhaps. I think plenty of people would miss the chunky silhouettes of these guys. Finally, for big firstborn armoured things, there's things like drop pods and Land Raiders, and I feel like these probably are at the point where they're just so iconic to the setting that Games Workshop wouldn't want to remove them. The Land Raider was one of the very first Space Marine kits, and seems unlikely that they'd want to take it out of the faction, though I suspect if there's any sort of update it might be really quite a late one coming perhaps, as they might have to do it hand in hand with the Chaos Land Raider, presuming that one gets updated too. Games Workshop do generally seem to be a bit reticent to update existing tank sculpts in the Warhammer 40k setting, and I feel like that's maybe with slightly good reason as well. I just can't imagine a Land Raider looking enormously different if they did a resculpt of it, and maybe the fine details aren't quite as big an issue when it's such a massive model to start with. The only thing that feels a little bit different to the Primaris scale Marines that it might be transporting into battle is the difference in size between the crewmen who are sticking their heads out the top of it and the standard Marines on the ground. I feel like the same is kind of true for the drop pod. It seems unlikely that GW would just remove one of the ways that Space Marines are best known for getting into battle. Though again, I'm not sure they'd be massively crazy to update it dead quick. They aren't exactly the most exciting miniatures ever. Basically an empty pod with a bunch of harnesses that Space Marines have got out of, even if they do definitely have a cool feel when you put them down in game. Otherwise, thinking maybe a bit beyond the obvious updates and redos that they might do, Space Marines are still a faction that conspicuously lack a super heavy style unit of any kind. The only two that would have to go on are the Astartes and the Thunderhawk made by Forge World, and it does make me wonder if at some point they might decide to make one in plastic at some stage. Not sure which they go for out of that. I'm still not sure if big plastic molds could actually handle something the scale of a Thunderhawk, even if it has been on the meme wish list for quite a while now. They could also revisit some models they've retired in the past, maybe Scout Bikers, the Hunter or Stalker tank, or the Thunderfire cannon, though I feel like all of them felt a little bit peripheral to the overall feel of Space Marines. And I'd argue that perhaps the Thunderfire cannon already has its Primaris equivalent in the Firestrike turret, not quite a direct replacement, but definitely a similar sort of feel. Maybe it's a lower level of priority, they could do something like release updated Stormflyers, or maybe do something with Centurions. I'm a bit uncertain as to what they do with Centurions at this point as well. Maybe just say that there's Primaris Marines inside there. They're a bit of a curious one that's very much part of the pre-Primaris range, but quite recent miniatures compared with most things. They certainly don't feel like the sort of thing that would be worthy of an update versus plenty of other stuff out there. Otherwise, beyond the core codex, the various Divergent Space Marine chapters are likely to get some stuff. For the Dark Angels, it really feels like they got one half of their updated range in 10th edition, and I really wouldn't be too surprised if that's followed up by another release wave in 11th. It just seems kind of conspicuous that they basically gave them a big Deathwing update with Deathwing Knights and Belial and an upgrade sprue aimed at the Terminators, and then they're still basically the only chapter to have old school Space Marine bikes now. Plus Samael wasn't touched, and neither was Ezekiel as well, and all of those were still kept around, despite Ezekiel being one of the few miniatures that is still made in metal, not even in resin. When the Dark Angels Codex rolls around in the next edition of the game, I don't think I'd be too surprised to see the Raven Wing take centre stage then. Given the Codex releases in 10th edition though, it seems odds on that the Space Wolves get something good this edition for multiple different reasons. Blood Angels, Dark Angels, and Space Wolves were generally the best supported Divergent chapters, at least before Black Templars got a whole bunch of stuff, but so far in 10th edition it seems very intentional that first we've had Dark Angels get a release wave, then we've had Blood Angels, and the Space Wolf Codex is still out there for some time later in the edition. With a big wave of Firstborn model removals and Primaris updates, seems that a similar sort of fate is coming for them, for better or worse, and might be a bit of a rocky time with some models losing support, just given how big the Space Wolf range is. They've got lots of units that are sort of pseudo their own thing, but not quite significantly different enough that I wouldn't trust Games Workshop just to use them as different models with an upgrade sprue. And a rather enormous cast of characters, some of which I'm sure will get new miniature sculpts, but I'm not sure all of them will. I'd guess perhaps for top priority there might be some flavour of Wolfguard gets new miniatures, and also the chapter master himself, Logan Grimnar, particularly given that we've got Azrael and Dante with their Primaris updates. Space Wolves at this point also seem to be the next chapter that are easily the most likely to get their Primarch back, due to being the only other major chapter out there with their own miniature range, given that Sanguinius is dead and likely not coming back for the Blood Angels. They didn't release any Primarchs in the end edition campaign of 9th edition, but they did in 7th and in 9th. And if they do wind up doing a rinse and repeat, I guess on paper it'd have Liam and Russ turning up, maybe having a nice battle against Fulgrim perhaps, maybe some other characters depending on whatever Games Workshop wants to progress, say with Vashtor, the Silent King, or the other big bads of 40k. Finally, that just leaves the other 3 chapters, which don't seem to be odds on to get any other big updates anytime soon. Blood Angels are currently just really having their release wave, with the models revealed, but a lot of it not released yet. Though admittedly, besides the character sculpts, which are broadly quite well received, the new Death Company and new Sanguinary Guard did both leave things to be desired. Perhaps slightly hopefully, it feels like a proper Death Company kit isn't necessarily completely ruled out for the distant future. It won't be with this Codex release, but the way that Games Workshop is aiming for you to field them with intercessors with an Eviscerator upgrade is a lot less than what they could do for them. The Blood Angels upgrade sprue isn't really in any way overly Death Company themed other than just generically chapter themed, and I'd hope at some point Games Workshop will eventually get round to actually re-releasing a new and proper Death Company kit with proper bespoke models. I'd certainly quite like it if they wind up doing that next edition, though it seems anything but certain. Though I'm sure plenty of people would happily have Gabriel Seth and the Librarian Dreadnought remade too. Out of those, I'd maybe say Seth might be a bit more likely than the Librarian Dreadnought. They just very rarely seem to do one-off custom vehicles for different factions versus different infantry squads. Otherwise, Deathwatch really drew the short straw of 10th edition, just basically being folded into the Inquisition and Agents book and losing access to a bunch of things that they had before, bar Legends. I feel like a Primaris scale Deathwatch kill team would be a bit of a no-brainer at some point, even if they don't have as much demand for the army that Games Workshop want to support them with a full faction. They can still certainly stretch to that, and I think it would be an overall good investment. And you never know, maybe they might eventually take the hint of the game kill team and release a Deathwatch kill team for that. Finally, Black Templars got a very complete range refresh in 9th edition. Basically all their major things were redone, and I'm not really 100% sure where they might go with them when they next get a Codex update. I guess my first thought might be something like a unique chaplain miniature. They are very well known for them after all, and maybe they could have a generic one to go alongside Grimaldus. I'm sure people very much wouldn't say no to something like a chapter-specific Terminator pattern or some sort of themed Dreadnought. I feel like there'd be odds on for one of Games Workshop's token character releases in 10th edition though, if they get anything. In any case, as you can tell, lots of possibilities for new Space Marines out there. It feels like for the rest of 10th edition we're perhaps most likely to see some updates on the Space Marine line of things, maybe with Liam and Ross turning up in an end edition campaign, and then potentially Marines getting really quite a lot of new stuff in the year where the edition comes to a close and the new one comes out, in a similar sort of vein to Shadowspear, and then the launch boxes for the next edition. Perhaps the single most certain things to get updates are the Terminator Assault Squad and the Vanguard Veterans, plus some new flavours of characters of one sort or another. They've really got a lot of options to choose from there. And then it's possibly going to be a slightly unpleasant game of seeing which of the other remaining Firstborn kits get actual Primaris updates or just sent to Legends without them. I guess I'd probably be most likely to predict further developments on the Redemptor chassis and perhaps some more armour like siege tanks or artillery tanks if they're going to have something to replace the Whirlwind and Vindicator tank. In any case though, let me know your thoughts as to what you suspect might come next for the Space Marines when they get updates. Look forward to hearing all your ideas down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to see more like this, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.